to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the July 24, 2019 edition of Space News. And good evening, space fans. This is Tina Stagg from the Space Association of Australia, and I'm on my own again this week, just like Sandra Bullock in Gravity. But after weeks of making anti-gravity jokes, there'll be no joke at Sandra Bullock's expense this week, because the joke appears to be on me. I've been alerted to the fact that it's Sandy's birthday on Friday, which also happens to be my birthday. So, happy birthday to us. Let's get started with some Aussie news. The Australian space community is asking the government to increase funding for the country's fledgling space agency. The year-old Australian Space Agency received less than $30 million over 4 years in the federal budget last year, plus $14 million for a space infrastructure fund. By comparison, the National Gallery of Australia received $46 million this year. Experts in industry and academia said while the agency is doing a good job, it needs a funding increase to grow the country's space industry. To US space policy news, the nominee to be the next Secretary of Defence said he'll work with Congress to create a space force. Mark Esper said at his Senate confirmation hearing last week he wants to work with the House and the Senate to come up with a right solution for the Space Force, reconciling the different language in the House and Senate defence authorisation bills with the administration's own proposal. He suggested in written testimony he had issues with the Senate bill that sets up a transition period for establishing a Space Force. He also said he supports the mission of the Space Development Agency, a newly created organisation that has come under political fire because of leadership turmoil. Congress and the White House remain at an impasse about reconciling different visions of establishing a space force. To the International Space Station, and a Soyuz rocket launched a new space station crew last week. The Soyuz MS-13 spacecraft carried Russian cosmonaut Alexander Skvortsov, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano, and American astronaut Drew Morgan to the ISS, arriving about 6 hours after liftoff. To NASA's Moon and Artemis program, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine told senators last week that a detailed cost estimate for the Artemis program likely won't be ready until early next year. Bridenstine told a Senate Commerce Committee hearing the agency was working with the administration on its fiscal year 2021 budget request, which will include a detailed estimate of the cost of returning humans to the moon by 2024. But that budget request won't be released until February of 2020. Bridenstine said the total cost could depend on the size of commercial contributions to elements like the lunar lander, but warned development of the lander could be jeopardised if NASA starts the 2020 US fiscal year on a continuing resolution. Meanwhile, Bridenstine says the urgency in getting humans back to the moon by 2024 led him to make changes in NASA leadership. Bridenstine said NASA didn't have a lot of time to waste in explaining his decision to reassign 2 top officials, including Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations Bill Gerstenmaier, in order to keep the program on track. Bridenstine said he believed commercial partners could reduce the estimated $20 to $30 billion cost of the Artemis program, but he also raised doubts about whether commercial crew vehicles would be ready to fly NASA astronauts by the end of the year. And Bridenstine says he won't rule out a first human mission to Mars in 2033. He told reporters last week that the agency was studying how its accelerated return to the moon can put forward plans for human missions to Mars. NASA has placed a new emphasis on its long-term Mars plans since a tweet by President Donald Trump in June that appeared to criticise the agency for talking too much about going back to the moon. Apollo 50 fever, perhaps. To international news and Russia. Russia launched a long-delayed astrophysics mission recently. A Proton rocket lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome and released the Spectre RG spacecraft 2 hours later. The spacecraft is bound for the Earth-Sun L2 Lagrange point, where it will arrive in about 3 months. The joint Russian-German mission will carry out an all-sky survey at X-ray wavelengths. China carried out the controlled deorbiting of its Tiangong-2 Space Lab into the South Pacific, the China Manned Space Engineering Office announced last week. The lab re-entered over the South Pacific Ocean using its own propulsion, following an engine burn to lower the spacecraft's perigee. The manoeuvre follows the high-profile and uncontrolled re-entry of Tiangong-1 in April last year. French President Emmanuel Macron announced plans recently for a space command in the country's military. Macron said a high command for space would be established in September within the French Air Force, calling space a true national security issue. To the UK, and the UK Space Agency has signed an agreement with NASA to cooperate on lunar exploration. The two agencies will establish a working group to coordinate joint scientific research and identify future opportunities to work together later this year. The agreement could enable the use of British communications and navigation systems on future NASA lunar missions and essentially opens the door to potentially flying a British astronaut to the moon, UK Science Minister Chris Skidmore said. The United States and the UK will also cooperate more closely in the areas of small satellites and responsive launches. UK Defence Minister Penny Mordaunt announced last week that the country will become the first international partner of Operation Olympic Defender, an effort started by US Strategic Command in 2013 to strengthen deterrence against hostile actions in space. India successfully launched its Chandrayaan-2 lunar mission earlier this week. The GSLV Mark III rocket lifted off on Monday from Sriharikota, India, releasing the Chandrayaan-2 spacecraft into an elliptical transfer orbit 16 minutes later. The launch was scheduled for more than a week ago, but postponed by what the Indian Space Agency ISRO described as a technical snag with the rocket. Chandrayaan-2 will gradually widen its transfer orbit, arriving at the moon in early September. The mission includes an orbiter and a lander, which will attempt a landing in the south polar regions of the moon. To commercial news. SpaceX said last week that an accident in April that destroyed a Crew Dragon spacecraft during ground tests was caused by a faulty valve. The ongoing investigation into the accident found that nitrogen tetroxide propellant in the vehicle's Super Draco thruster system leaked through a valve into helium tubes during ground processing. When that system was pressurised just before the planned ignition of the thrusters, a slug of oxidizer was hurled against the check valve, shattering it and then igniting it. SpaceX said it will replace the check valves in the system with burst discs that won't leak. Neither NASA nor SpaceX provided an updated schedule for upcoming test flights, including the vehicle's first crewed mission, but SpaceX said it was increasingly difficult to fly that crewed mission this year. The vehicle, a prototype of the company's next-generation Starship vehicle, was engulfed in a fireball after the test at SpaceX's South Texas test site. That postponed its initial free flight, which had been scheduled for this week. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk said the fireball was from a post-test fuel leak that caused only minor damage and that the hover test had been rescheduled. And to ULA. An issue with the same component has delayed launch of United Launch Alliance's Atlas V and Delta IV rockets. ULA said last week the Delta IV launch of a GPS satellite, which was scheduled for July 25, had been postponed to at least August 22. The company earlier delayed an Atlas V launch of the AEHF-5 military communications satellite from mid-July to August 8. ULA said that the delays were due to an anomaly with an unspecified component during testing at a supplier, and the company later confirmed it was the same component in the upper stages of each rocket. Both rockets use the RL-10 engine in their upper stages, but engine manufacturer Aerojet Rocketdyne said the problem was not with the engine itself. To Virgin Galactic's merger deal is probably not a model for the rest of the space industry, investors say. At a conference last week, investors said the reverse IPO approach, where Virgin Galactic is merging with a publicly traded investment company, is unusual and, combined with the personalities involved, makes it unlikely to be used by other companies. Some warned that parts of the industry were headed for a consolidation phase that will leave behind only a handful of companies. In other news, a test pilot killed in a Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 accident in 2014 will be added to a memorial at the Kennedy Space Centre. The board of the Astronaut Memorial Foundation voted unanimously last week to add Mike Olsbury to the Space Mirror Memorial after changing its rules to allow private as well as government astronauts to be considered for the memorial. Olsbury was the co-pilot on a Spaceship 2 test flight in October 2014 and was killed when the vehicle broke apart. And in sad news, iconic NASA flight director Chris Kraft has died, aged 95. Christopher Columbus Kraft Jr., NASA's first flight director who helped build the US space program, died on Monday, just days after the world celebrated the historic Apollo 11 walk on the moon. During an era with no calculators and only rudimentary computers, Kraft essentially built NASA's mission control to manage human operations in space. As NASA scrambled to catch the Soviet Union during the late 1950s and early 1960s, Kraft wrote mission rules and operating procedures for the country's early forays into space. Later, during the Gemini program, Kraft recruited and developed a team of flight directors, allowing him to move into planning for the Apollo moon missions. He is survived by his wife of 68 years, Betty Ann, and his two children, Gordon and Christiane. And finally, Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 spacesuit is on display at the National Air and Space Museum for the first time in more than a decade. The museum formally dedicated a new exhibit of the restored suit last week. The suit had been on display at the museum since it opened in the mid-1970s, but was taken out in 2006 to inspect and ultimately to restore it. The restoration effort should extend the suit's life for at least another 50 years. And that's it from the space news this week. Back to Andrew.